John chapter 6, verses 1 through 15 this morning. Here's what the word of the Lord says. It reads as this: After this, Jesus went away to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, which is the Sea of Tiberias, and a large crowd was following him because they saw signs that he was doing on the sick. Jesus went up on the mountain, and there he sat down with his disciples. And now the Passover, the feast of the Jews, was at hand. Lifting up his eyes then, and seeing that a large crowd was coming toward him, Jesus said to Philip, "Where are we to buy bread so that these people may eat?" He said, "This is to test him, for he himself knew what he would do." Philip answered him, 200 denarii worth of bread would not be enough for each of them to get a little. One of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, "There is a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. But what are they for so many?" Jesus said, "Have the people sit down." Now there was much grass in the place, and so the men sat down, about 5,000 in number. And Jesus then took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed them to those who were seated. So also the fish, as much as they wanted. And when they had eaten their fill, he told his disciples, "Gather up the leftover fragments, that nothing may be lost." So they gathered them up and filled 12 baskets with fragments from the 5 barley loaves left by those who had eaten. And when the people saw the sign that he had done, they said, "This is indeed the prophet who is to come into the world." Perceiving then that they were about to come and take him by force to make him king, Jesus withdrew again to the mountain by himself. Praise be to God for the reading of his word this morning. You guys can go ahead and have a seat. I would like to tag the text for our exchange this morning. This is our Exodus. This is our Exodus. As we read our passage this morning, we may recall the story of Jesus feeding 5,000 people. And this story tends to be one of the more significant miracles that transpire throughout the gospel narratives outside of the resurrection. But it's often when we read this passage, we jump straight to Jesus' ability to provide and to do miraculous works. And that is such a factual observation that I do not want us to move beyond that observation, but we tend to miss out on the significance of the miracle, considering the Jewish calendar and also its symbolic connection to deliverance. You might be wondering, why didn't I just not simply tag the text feeding the 5,000 and keep on moving on? But I think here's the idea that we need to understand, that this text is deeply embedded within the grand narrative of Scripture, and it's echoing the motif of the biblical text. In other words, the themes that transpire even early on in Exodus and Deuteronomy and Leviticus, this text today is pulling from those themes, and it's building a case for us. My hope this morning is to reorient our minds to seeing the full canvas of God's miraculous works and how it is interconnected to his divine redemption. See, they are not just simply separate occurrences that signify God's ability to do the unexpected. His signs are a reminder of God's ability to work in the midst of those who are held captive by sin, captive by circumstance. It's a foretaste, if I could, of the deliverance that will transpire, that can come from God. As we walk through this text, you're going to hopefully understand by the end of how this moment can catch a vision for us, to give us that vision of how this can be our Exodus moment in our own lives. Friends, the first observation this morning is this, is that divine signs point us to deliverance. Divine signs point us to deliverance. Picking up in verse 1, we see another transition moment in Jesus' ministry. the after this. It designates and establishes a sequence of chronology here, which is giving some space within this timeline to understand what has happened in Jesus' ministry. He had been ministering in Galilee, and this is coming to the end of the completion of his ministry in the Galilee region of Galilee. And John's gospel account does not spend much other time talking about his ministry in Galilee. And that's a very significant observation for us to understand, because John is actually aware of the other gospel writers and what they have been talking about of the ministry in this region. John intentionally does not engage in those conversations. To fill in some of the gaps, you could go back and read Matthew chapter 5 through chapter 7, where the Sermon on the Mount happens. We can think back to the miracles near Capernaum. We can think about the disciples' missionary journeys that happened in Matthew chapter 10. See, the other Gospels help to fill the gap in this period. But there's this transition moment that happens here where John wants to make sure that his readers hear about this one story. And it's interesting, though, because John introduces us to this story. And the miracle that we see in our text is the only one to appear in every gospel account besides the resurrection. What transpires in the green field is notable for this massive transition of thought. See, prior to this moment, Jesus was beginning to gather large crowds of followers because of his public ministry. His proclamation of the good news about the kingdom that was at hand led people to begin to follow him. But it wasn't just that. It was the signs that they were seeing. See, in verse 2, we learned that a crowd had followed him. Why? Because they had witnessed the miraculous signs. We would like to say that they understood who Jesus really was, and they were seeking to follow him for those reasons, but they had seen the signs that he had done, which led them to say that they were believing in him. But it's interesting here because the text makes it clear for us a little bit later on that many might have believed in him, but we're not willing to obey him. Hear me on that this morning. You might be able to believe that he is the God of the miraculous, but you could also not be willing to obey him in belief. See, here in this text, we see this idea unfolding for us. I mean, think on it for a moment. Does the supernatural acts of God move you to acknowledge him in belief, or does it lead you to belief and obedience? As we've discussed, true belief in Christ throughout this series, we've seen that the belief is reliance, it is trust, and it is adherence to who God is. That's the semantic range of that word in the original language. And so when Jesus is calling people to belief, it's not just cognitive understanding. It's not just the private declaration, but it's something that leads to a wholesale trust in life, a wholesale adherence in life. And this is what Jesus is calling people to. But the separation begins to happen in this text, because we cannot separate belief from obedience. And the miraculous drew the crowd to see the main attraction. But were they willing to give up on the habits of life? Later on in the same chapter, it says that many of them depart from him after this miraculous sign. It helps to signify this idea for us. See, the experience of the miraculous, friends, has never been about the awe and the shock. And for many of us, we just want to see God do great things, magnificent things in our lives. We want to see him move mountains in certain spaces in our lives. We want to see him work in miraculous ways. But for many of us, it's just all for the awe and shock. Just simply to be able to say that he is God. See, maybe you've personally seen God work out something miraculous in your life. It could have been a financial situation. You didn't know how you were going to pay a bill, but God showed up and he paid the bill for you. Maybe it was a health-related issue. You just didn't know how your body was going to be able to recover. You're just looking for him, and maybe he did provide for you in those moments, or even maybe he provided for you, an unexpected vocational situation. Oh, you didn't know how he was going to work it out. You know, if you're going to have a job, if you're going to keep your job, whatever it might be. You did not know how he was going to work. And God did the miraculous. But it wasn't simply for you to look up and to acknowledge him. But it was a hope that you would trust him with your life. Friends, I hope you're hearing me on this morning, because there's a difference here between you just acknowledging that he can do some great things and you walking in trust and in obedience to God. See, the miraculous act is just part of the process of deliverance. The act is the foretaste of how God will bring about deliverance in your life. See, typically, we are not satisfied with the taste of his powerful hand. We want to become gluttonous for the miraculous works. We thus then try to downplay God's ability to deliver us into his kingdom, and we settle for the appetizer. We want to go on down to Red Lobster and get that all-you-can-eat food, and that appetizer list, Go tear it up. But you miss out on the main course. You miss out on what God truly has for you. You forsake the main course because of your own self-indulgence for that miracle. I don't know if you're hearing me this morning. Let me say it another way. The sign is just a declaration that he is God. The signs are a means to point us to his deliverance. That he is the one who can free you from your captivity. See, not to be the breadth of our understanding of deliverance. And for many of us, our ability to view God as a deliverer is left solely to him doing the miraculous in your life. See, that's why you have such a small vision of God being able to free you, for you can have this Exodus moment. See, in Exodus, the signs and the plagues prove that God is an active agent in the world. They served as a foretaste of how God would deliver them from Egyptian captivity. I mean, Israel couldn't see what was outside of Egypt. They did not understand what deliverance to the promised land would look like. They just saw the acts. They knew he was there. So they were trying to trust him, but they didn't know what was on the other side. Church, hear me on this. Too many of us are settling for the miracles in Egypt instead of receiving deliverance into the promised land. Hear me on that. You're just getting so happy about what's happening in your Babylon that you can't even get excited and see what's going to happen in the new heavens and the new earth. Friends, because one takes more faith and trust that you actually have to trust him to take you there. So you want to keep seeing the miraculous in this world instead of experience deliverance into Jesus' kingdom, which will be a reality in the city that Jesus is building. This is just a foretaste of the sign of what he's doing to deliver you, friends. Leads me to the second observation from this text. Our Passover lamb came to provide deliverance. Our Passover lamb came to provide deliverance. Verse 4 says, now the Passover, the feast of the Jews, was at hand. You know how easy it is for us to just quickly bypass that verse in this text and to jump straight to the feeding of the 5,000? Often we overlook him feeding the 5,000 outside of the context of verse 4. But the 5,000 individuals were pilgrims looking to participate in the celebration of Israel's divine deliverance. That was part of the Passover feast. They're coming to the table to be thankful for how God passed over them and protected them from judgment. He brought them out of Egypt. So it's a group of people who did not have a space to celebrate this feast. But they came to Jesus because they're looking for the sign in this moment. As the text says, they had previously seen the miraculous works, but they were looking to experience something more. See, as Jesus is sitting on the mountain, he looks up and he sees a crowd coming near him. As the text says, he lifts his eyes and has compassion on the people. He looks at them intentionally. And based on textual evidence here, we can assume that many people who are more wealthy or well off, they could have their own feast in their own homes. They had somewhere to go. But these are people who are maybe homeless, looking for a home, maybe poor. And if you put this in the right context, it reminds you even to some of his words echoed in the Sermon on the Mount that might have happened just prior to this. Blessed are you who are poor, for yours is the kingdom of God. And the Lamb's ability to come to not take sides in this moment, to privilege no people, but Jesus has compassion, and he moves towards those who are longing for more. But he doesn't just only offer them a good, he offers himself. And many times we get caught up on the good that he offers here. He doesn't neglect the tangible, but his provision is a moment to attest that he can serve as the role of Redeemer in our lives. And many of us just get caught up by that provision. See, his disciples, particularly Philip, questioned the ability of the group to be able to feed this many people. Many of you guys will be the Philips in the room. I mean, where are we to buy bread so that these people may eat? I mean, Philip asked the question that he asked is typically considered in our culture the common sense question. I mean, duh, we should ask that question. But this assumes that the nature is right here. It assumes that human reason is the way that they need to be thinking in this moment. I mean, they're thinking to Philip probably, I mean, oh yeah, you're being analytical in this moment. Some of us have that analytical tendency. And that actually hinders us from seeing God's ability to deliver us out because we get so confined into our situation, our circumstance, to try to maneuver ways out ourselves. But Jesus understands our human minds. He understands our heart. He understands our tendencies to reason in particular ways, and that it's confined to our own philosophies. That's why the text says Jesus tested him. For he knew himself what he would do. See, Philip answers him and says, we only have 200 denarii, which is 8 months worth of wages. In other words, ain't nobody in this crew got enough money to provide for this many people. Okay, so in this moment, this remark from Philip is a sense of doubt. Then we all have this one friend who makes the snide remark. While everyone else is just perplexed in the moment. And for them, they're like, well, this is my spiritual gift. You know, I offer these comments. Probably is not, but it's okay. We have Peter's brother, Andrew. It's been a minute since he's come back into the textual conversation. He's there early on, but he comes back up in this moment. And see what the text says there. He said, there is a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. But what are they for so many? He's like, I mean, we could try this. And it's such an interesting moment. Because he's that friend that probably gets laughed off in the moment. Or overlooked by that statement. Like, man, they're just in them. But Jesus says, hold my mic here. He's saying, watch what I can do with this moment. So he says, have the people sit down. Remember, the Passover celebration feast is to celebrate God's deliverance of Israel out of Egyptian captivity. I mean, they would joyfully reflect on what God has done through food and drink. So hopefully you're seeing the parallels here. On this day, this time frame, Jesus is setting them down in the grass. Not at a feast table, but in the grass. And he's going to seek to provide for them in this moment. The first Passover feast was celebrated with a group of pilgrims who were seeking to worship their God as they were leaving Egypt. We see that in Exodus chapter 12, verse 3. They would take a lamb without blemish and prepare it as a memorial of how God passed over their homes when he held the Egyptians accountable. We see this Passover feast come up 3 times in Jesus' ministry. It occurred in the first time is when Jesus made his self-designation of being the temple that would never be destroyed. The third one comes at the time of his death. This is the second instance, which is significant because we will see this explained in verse 33 and 51 of chapter 6, that he is the bread of life. See, we see the Exodus motif of deliverance on display in our text, and the story is building. The crowd is sitting in the grass, as John describes, while Luke states it a little bit differently. Luke states it's a desolate place. They're thirsty. They're desiring more. They're starving. They need this deliverance. See, Luke uses figurative language to share, even though they were in the grass, this was a state of desperation, kind of like the Israelites in the wilderness who were starving and looking for deliverance. See, John chapter 5, verse 46, Jesus states, see, Moses wrote about me. However, he doesn't go into too much detail of how Moses was pointing to him. See, we have the moment in our text where Jesus reveals how much greater he is than Moses. And this act would help them to realize, because I gave too much credit to Moses for being the one to lead them to this point where God would work. So with 5,000 people on the Passover, when they celebrate this lamb, Jesus is giving them a foretaste of the lamb who would come, who would die on the cross, slain for them, blood poured out for them to redeem them. See, with 5,000 people before him, he gave thanks unto God for provision, and he distributes to those around him. He did not skim on them. He didn't try to count his costs, but he gave it to them, the abundance of food. And as the text says, they had a feast in the plains, and they ate their fill. It was miraculous. I mean, he took 2 barley loaves and 2 fish and fed everyone and had excess. 12 baskets were left. This moment shows the provision of the Lord, and as stated in Jeremiah chapter 31, verse 14, my people will be filled with my bounty. Interpreters draw many symbolic elements from the leftover fragments. He has enough to supply the needs of his people, but also excess to supply the needs of those who are not yet his people. We are like those in the text who could have experienced the signs from God that reveal his deity and character, yet his miracles is not just to attest to his ability to provide, but so that we can encounter him and his ability to redeem. See, those who were held captive before the Exodus were people who needed redemption from captivity of their own sin and brokenness in the broken world around them. And Jesus here is providing that sign to them of his person and his work. See, in our text, we learn that Jesus is greater than Elisha. Elisha took 20 barley loaves and fed 100 men by God's hand. Jesus made that look like light work. We learn that Jesus is greater than Moses because God used him to lead the Israelites in the wilderness while God provided the manna from heaven. And Jesus in our passage gives new manna. God provided for Israel, and Jesus provides for his people. This is just a foretaste because he would, as we know, the text says, he goes to the cross one day to provide that ultimate sacrifice for us so that we can enjoy that Passover celebration as well. That lamb that was slain for us to prepare a way, to pave a way from us to God. This leads me to my third observation from the text this morning, is that provision, friends, can misdirect our attention away from deliverance. Provision can misdirect our attention away from deliverance. See, once they experience the miracle of God, they finally concluded, this is the prophet who has come into the world. This is him. They're finally making sense of some of the things that Moses had been talking about. Just imagine, this is the second year of Jesus' ministry, when large groups of people began to realize who he truly was. It started to become crystal clear for them that, oh man, he might be the one. Deuteronomy chapter 18, verse 15 says this, the Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me from among you, from your brothers. It is to him you shall listen. This is Moses talking to the people of God. Deuteronomy chapter 18, verse 18, I will raise up for them a prophet like you from among their brothers. And I will put my words in his mouth, and he shall speak to them all that I've commanded him. Jesus is the one. This is the prophet. They've finally seen him. But you would think they would have come to this realization before this moment. That it would take for him to provide for them food to begin to open their eyes. But that's not how it happened. His provision gained their attention in natural terms. Instead of showing them the supernatural significance of his deliverance, the way that he would deliver them. They became fixated on him being able to provide on earth. Therefore, the prophets were these respected leaders in this community. And so they said, okay, the prophet can lead us here. We'll figure it out ourselves, and we'll try to get him to the right place that he needs to be at in this time period, so that he can lead us and move us forward. But it's all because they became so captivated by the natural. It's interesting here because this idea of them receiving provision was really shaping their perspective. Because they were looking at him and they saw Jesus now as a rising star. If you're a fan of maybe sports or any industry, it could be music, whatever, when they find maybe untapped talent, young talent, that you see them as a rising star. Here's a moment where they see Jesus and they're like, okay, he's the one who can lead us. But was it with the right intentions? See, the text says that Jesus begins to perceive their intentions. See, friends, God knows our intentions, whether we admit it or not. He understands how we are seeing his provision. And friends, maybe God has provided for you in the past few months, the past year, maybe this week. He's done things that you didn't understand that he could do. But he understands your heart and your reception of that provision. He can tell if it leads you to worship or if it leads you towards self-indulgence. See, he realized that it was indulgence for this group. And as the text says, they were going to take him by force to make him king, because they wanted more of that type of provision, because it got them what they wanted in this world. They wanted a king for their own possession and good. They wanted their own genie in a bottle. Friends, maybe that's been your vision of God. You just want him to provide for you, to do the miraculous when you want him to, on your timing, so that you can know that he's there, you can know that he's God, so that you can rest assured and keep doing your own thing. You want Babylon still. You want Egypt still, just with a few miraculous moments of God working. See, their version of a king, this was not the hope that the king that one day would fill the Davidic line. They wanted Jesus to build a kingdom for their own sake, not for the Father's sake. See, they viewed him in political terms of bringing a revolution that they could profit from. Is that why you want to see God do the miraculous, so that you can keep profiting off of what he does? It was a cult-like force, is what the text is saying, of them establishing their kingdom. They miss the heart of God's provision in the Exodus moment. See, God delivers them to bring them into a relationship that will one day culminate in his kingdom. And they were being offered the foundation to what Jesus would later communicate as him being the bread of life. But provision misdirected their aims, and it allowed them to become selfishly consumed by gaining more blessings and to get a feel in this world. But Jesus offers himself to them. But they were distracted, and they missed the purpose of his work. Is that you today, friends? You've seen God's provision in so many different areas, but you're so distracted by what he's done for you, you're just hungry for more. And you've missed him. You've missed the full power of what he can actually do. See, God provides, but we become infatuated by the provision, and in a gluttonous manner continue down a pathway zealous for more, friends. See, prior to the Israelites' reception of the manna, the Israelites complained about the timing of God's provision and declared that they had rather be slaves than to die in the wilderness. They'd rather have Egyptian captivity than the Exodus. And friends, maybe that's you. You're so frustrated in the season, and you're frustrated with God's timing of doing miraculous things in your life, that you're like, I'd rather go back into the world, the lifestyle that I was living in, than to wait on the Lord for his kindness and the way that he delivers. See, the sign was a blessing in the moment, but the route to the promised land was more taxing. It's remembering that God will deliver you. See, once they did receive the manna, the Israelites were willing to even hoard that manna So they continued in their own venture of self-provision in Exodus chapter 16, verses 19 through 20. Friends, where are you at in the spectrum? How are you thinking about how God provides in your life? Do you see it as being a wholesale part of his redemptive plan, or for your own indulgence? See, the text is a mirror of God's previous work among the Israelites. The Israelites, like us, were in captivity to their circumstances and sin, and only God could deliver them from it all. Quick fixes do not help those who are held captive, friends. And maybe you felt that in your life. Maybe it's your circumstances. Maybe it's your own sin within your heart. You're held captive by it. But God did not provide the manna for them to resort back into trusting their own habits and their own ways. But he wanted them to look towards him. They wanted him and them to trust to him ultimately. So he fed the 5,000 to remind them of his ability to deliver. And that the promise that he would deliver. It was his miraculous acts that are a foretaste of his deliverance. So today, friends, we know that one day, the king that provided to feed the 5,000 will one day come back for his people. That he set the stage of the feast already by him going to the cross. And that is the affirmation that the deliverance is coming. Until we journey to that day where he is with us, feasting again in the new heavens and new earth, those miraculous works that he might work out in your life are just reminders. They're signs that point you to that he is the deliverer, that he is the one that's going to get you through. Friends, do not mistake the purpose of God's work in your life and how he provides in these moments. It's supposed to remind you that the king has come to set the captives free and that he will work this out. Friends, this is how it's our Exodus. Because it's reminding us, as the manna did in the wilderness, that God's still working to bring about that deliverance. And maybe today you have forgotten that purpose of God working in your life, and that's supposed to remind you of what he's going to do in the end. Friends, look to Jesus in this way. Don't treat him as an object for your own possession. Don't try to make him king of the world that you want to build. But remember that he is doing something great in the world through his redemptive plan.